This is why we're really here, right, Jimmy?
Yeah. Palmer's Picks almost always is going to be the highlight of these issues for me. This issue, Palmer looks at the work of Eddie Campbell. We talked about him briefly last issue because he is the collaborator of Alan Moore on the book From Hell. Probably one of his higher profile projects, probably the highest profile project, but he has several major works. Besides his collaborations with Alan Moore, he does a series called Bacchus or Deadface. I believe it was published originally as Deadface, and that's a lot of what Tom Palmer focuses on. And it's an updating of Greek mythology. So he's taking Bacchus, the god of wine, and it's basically telling his contemporary story. So he's a god in modern times. Many of the other Greek gods are part of that storyline too, so they come into contact with each other. And in some ways, I see it as a riff on Jack Kirby's Thor comics. Mm-hmm. At least visually, I think there's some reference there, even to Vince Colletta's inking style.
Sure.
I think Eddie Campbell I find his art beautiful.
I have some questions, Jim, because I have all these Bacchus comics here, and I confess I haven't gotten to them yet. You know what I mean? I have a big to-read pile. So I have these 10 trades, and I have a question for you, man. So like, here are just some of these trades. You could go through
I'll
them
flip through
or whatever.
a couple while we're
But I also have tons of issues too, right?
Yes.
And I take a look in issue 2 of Bacchus right here. And the story here, King Bacchus, Part 1, Page 1. This story takes place in Bacchus trade number 9. So what the hell is going on here, man?
So this is the UK. Eddie Campbell comes out of the UK small press scene of the 80s. And, you know, if we think of small press like SPX as being obscure and stuff in the 90s and early 2000s, the 80s UK scene, just imagine even smaller, you know. So these guys are self-publishing and doing what they can. The first Deadface series, I believe, was published by Harrier, which was a UK publisher. Combined with like the 80s black and white boom and bust. And so he was publishing wherever he could find outlets. You know, he's published by several different publishers and in several different anthologies. Things like Dark Horse Presents. You know, he did a lot with Dark Horse. Some of these, I believe, were published by Top Shelf, which would have come up in the late 90s and into the 2000s. And he would basically make these stories wherever he had an outlet for them. So you might get a short story, you might get a story serialized across, you know, an ongoing anthology opening, and then he would collect them and they would make sense. It would be like, okay, this is a bigger story, you know, like 4 parts were serialized here and this part, you know, appears for the first time maybe in the trade. And he would kind of tie it all together that way. And when they started reprinting these, they were even printed out of order. You know, so it's not just you finding stuff that's like in the early issues of his self-published Bacchus series as then in, you know, some late volume of Bacchus. Like, that's how they were printed. I can remember when I was reading these things originally, there would be like no volume 7 and 8, you know, or volumes, you know, 9 would come out before those. So it's just a strange, that's small press, you know, and especially for somebody who's very prolific, but also doing stuff like, you know, this doesn't fit in Marvel. You know, this is a guy whose whole career is existing kind of wherever he can find it, especially before the internet. And you can see how radical he was in terms of his visual, almost restlessness, you know, trying different stuff, different styles, different textures. So collaborating with different people. I know Dave Sim is in some of these somewhere. I think must have appeared in Cerebus, you know, possibly the story I'm talking about. I love the texture stuff, though. Look how great this is. There's no holding line at all. It's just Zipatone for his pants. Probably like a photocopied photo.
Yeah, high contrast photos.
So very inventive visually and a broad range of stories. You know, some of the stories would adapt like old myths. You know, and it would feature these characters in those old myths. Very inventive and collaborating with different people. This one might be...
That's awesome.
Yeah, that looks like Shaky Kane, although I don't know that it is.
I was at the Brooklyn Book Festival.
I think
with
this
him.
is a crazy, cool character design, though.
Oh yeah, for
Eyeball
sure,
Kid.
For sure. And he keeps it consistent. Like he keeps all the rows consistent. The patches, you know, third from the top, like all this.
That weird serialization was a big part of how I made Afrodisiac, because Afrodisiac was a character that I was drawing and writing. And it would just appear in whatever anthologies would come up for the first several stories. And at some point, we started to kind of envision what is the big overarching story, you know? And so, like, we were appearing in different anthologies, but ultimately they would fit together, you know, like basically based on probably reading the Comics Journal interview with Eddie Campbell.
I was at the Brooklyn Book Festival with him a couple months back, and that dude, he does not play around, man. Like, we went to the airport roughly the same time, and you get your one carry-on, your one small item, and then your carry-on luggage or whatever. He his small item was like a bandolier of like, a Chewbacca belt of drawing supplies, wrapped around like a little sketchbook, man. So I get the impression that he's a graphomaniac of sorts.
Yes, the other big work of his is the character Alec. And Alec's mentioned a little bit here, but this is the early days for Eddie Campbell. He's done a lot of work since the early 90s and a lot of work with Alec. Not exactly auto-bio, but kind of. This was an early Alec comic book that Fantagraphics published. You can see it's that oversized magazine edition called Little Italy. And he does seem to be very prolific. Like, there are comic stories of him in his apartment with his knee board, like just sitting on the floor drawing. So I think you're right.
He wore this outfit on the way to the airport. Alec is what's referenced a lot whenever people talk about like the Eddie Campbell comics that they hold in highest regard.
Yeah, I think this stuff's great. This is some of the first Eddie Campbell that I came across. This is a Top Shelf edition. Top Shelf has published big omnibuses of this stuff. Of both Alec. Of Bacchus and of Alec. So pretty easy to find. But visually, the stories themselves, I think he's a very strong writer. But visually, I just loved what he was doing in terms of the black and white. Again, the textures, all these different zipatone patterns. I remember one reviewer describing it as using zipatone to create atmosphere. It's just I don't know who else was working quite like this. So that was my big reaction to Eddie Campbell at the time and what I think of with him. And then this is my standout Eddie Campbell story in terms of Alec. So this is an auto-bio story, and he actually did another version of this like 10 years earlier that appeared, I think, in Prime Cuts. Which is pretty easy to track down too, and it's like a 4-page story, but it's about his experience, basically an affair with this girl that, it all kind of happens very quickly, and he draws it to evoke that speed, like the energy of that relationship. He described it in the Comics Journal as almost drawing on a cocktail napkin would be the effect that you're going for, and if you look, you can see, like, these are really dashed out. They still hold up. We mentioned the 9-panel grid that he uses a lot, and you see it here, but it's free, like it's not rigidly ruled out, but it makes, out of this chaos, you're able to read this relatively easily, even though it is like nuts.
Yeah, it's a great piece of cartooning right here.
Yeah, and I became a huge fan of his lettering. Like this was lettering that, coming from Marvel and DC, this was not what I was seeing in lettering. The idea that all of this stuff can be expressive, very eye-opening. And this is, in a way, we've talked about Chester Brown's I Never Liked You. This is a similar idea where, like, it's a relationship comic, not exactly a romance, but very different than the genre stuff I was used to. And this is published by Tundra, 1993, so it comes out after this article, but it's still kind of this time period, especially Tundra dates it, I think, to put it in this time period. Tom Palmer closes out this article talking about what's coming up, what his plans are for future issues. Hepcats. I think that's next issue. Ted McKeever's Eddie Current and Metropole, I'm a big fan of. Scott McCloud, who hasn't released it yet, but of course will be known for Understanding Comics, which will be coming out within a year of this. So pretty exciting, the upcoming slate.
Yeah, I see Rick Veitch's name as well. Rick Veitch is going to get some coverage, man, with the Brat Pack, the One type comics, and then the Dream comics come later, and it'll get its own little Palmer's Picks.
I'm excited for that. Somebody asked about more Brat Pack coverage.
Yeah.
I'm super excited to dive into that one because that was a formative book for me.
It's going to give me an excuse to reread it too.